In 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower called this film the greatest war picture I have ever seen. What was this movie, and why did Dwight Eisenhower have such a high opinion of it? Let's find out that and much, much more in this episode of Real History. Something worth mentioning from the outset is that this movie also set a precedent for productions like Platoon, Saving Private Ryan, and Band of Brothers because the director forced his actors to participate in a 2-week boot camp so they could carry themselves accordingly on screen. And ultimately, 150 veterans of the European Theater of Operations were hired either as technical consultants, background extras, or speaking actors in this movie. And suffice it to say, this decision on the part of the filmmakers pays off with big dividends on the authenticity front. Authenticity was very much on the minds of service members when they heard that producer Lester Cowan was going to be making a biopic about Ernie Pyle. And Cowan's office was flooded with mail from service members offering suggestions as to how he might create a more authentic movie. And one of the best of these bits of correspondence was written by Sergeant Jack Foisey of Stars and Stripes newspaper. And it is entitled A GIs 10 Commandments. So these are points of direction as to how you can achieve this in the movie. And this is what Sergeant Foisey said in the first of 4 of 10 commandments. Number 1, if there is going to be any heroine, it should be an evacuation hospital nurse, and she should really look beat up, but still good to a guy who is in pain and far from home. Number 2, don't have all the wounded gritting their teeth. A few do cry, and not all men die with a terrific punch line on their lips. Number 3, there is humor in war, but it is often subtle and bitter. Number 4, don't make the film sentimental, and the GI's patriotism should not be obvious. It has been in most Hollywood pictures. His belief in the right of what he is fighting for should be sensed rather than seen or heard. So these are some great bits of insight and commentary from a frontline reporter.
Hey, you! Get that pooch out of here. Do you want to get him killed?
Well, so long, E-Ram. What do you think about that?
To start off, the movie uses composite characters to trace true life stories of men in the 1st, 34th, and 36th Infantry Divisions through North Africa and Italy. The movie doesn't quite reach Western Europe. It sticks to the Mediterranean for the most part. Anecdotes were taken from Pyle's books Brave Men, Here Is Your War, of which I have an original copy, and these various stories were edited from his columns, put into book form, and all of these became the basis for many of the scenes depicted in this film.
Correspondent, ain't you? The flyers are the guys you guys always write about. The Hollywood heroes. Ask Inglis, he'll tell you.
Yeah, just one plane and you're all dead ducks.
Aviation actually had a major bearing on the life of the director who made this film. When Hollywood came knocking at his door asking for movie rights to his war stories, Ernie Pyle knew that he had to help producer Lester Cowan find the right man. And they thought that William Wild Bill Wellman was indeed their man. Wellman had served in the famous Lafayette Escadrille during World War I, and he had directed the first film to win Best Picture at the Academy Awards, and that is the silent classic Wings. Wellman was known as a tough guy maverick of a filmmaker, but there's also a sensitivity in him because he saw wartime camaraderie among combatants as something of a love story as well. And I think Pyle wrote about similar love through his stories chronicling GIs in North Africa, the Mediterranean, Western Europe, and then ultimately the Pacific.
I hear we're getting in the real business tomorrow.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, they can deal me out. This is a modern war, ain't it? And I'm a modern guy, and the modern age is up in the air. That's where I belong, not down here.
Many World War II servicemen felt the same way about combat. They wanted to be on the cutting edge, and some had no desire to slog in the mud or become trapped in a flooding boiler room on a naval vessel. This was most certainly the case with my now 101-year-old co-author of Into the Cold Blue, John Hman. And despite John being in peak physical condition, he aspired to the Air Forces because he wanted to press himself with mastering new technology, and that is what was associated with the Air Forces. But unfortunately, as he was to find out, there was a whole other world of danger and misery that awaited him 4 miles above the earth. But on this point, interestingly enough, Pyle was an advocate of infantrymen receiving fight pay in the same way that airmen received flight pay. So I think that's an interesting analogy between the service branches.
Tomorrow, you boys of the 18th Infantry will meet our armies for the first time. Armies that have beaten the world. The French, the British, the Russians. What chance do you stand?
Mildred Gillers was an American expat who gained very lucrative employment on German state radio in 1940, and by this stage of the war shown in the film, she hosted a program called the Home Sweet Home Hour, which was meant to psychologically demoralize GIs with taunts of home front infidelities and homesickness and things of that nature. And popular tunes of the era were sprinkled throughout this sort of propaganda and these taunts between the songs. But Gillers became known as Axis Sally, and despite being found guilty of treason after the war, eventually lived out her life in an Ohio convent. And really odd enough, I just recently learned that she lived for a spell in Conneaut, Ohio, where the large D-Day reenactment takes place on an annual basis in the modern era. So kind of strange.
Hey, Pop! Why wasn't you born a beautiful dame? Or even an ugly one?
Oh, why don't you guys pipe down?
All right, all right.
This is one of several lines in this movie that is taken directly from the Willie and Joe cartoons of artist Bill Mauldin, who, like Pyle, blended humor and horror to illustrate the humanity of the grunts out in the field. And I think the point of the line is not only the fact that these guys had cravings for female accompaniment, but that they had also spent so much time with their pards that a lot of them had come to know their comrades better than any girls or girlfriends that they had had back home. And this was also one of the points that reporter Jack Foisey insisted of in his 10 Commandments to Lester Callan, that you should aspire to the look and demeanor of Bill Mauldin's cartoons. But while we're on the topic of appeal, it's also worth mentioning that Wellman didn't want any big stars to be in this movie. He didn't want the story to be distracted by a famous personality, and he therefore picked 2 relatively unknowns of that time. Burgess Meredith being one who would later play the Penguin in the Batman series, and also Rocky Balboa's trainer in the Rocky movies. Meredith had actually been an active duty captain in the Army, and he had to be released from the service to actually make this film. The other unknown that Wellman chose was Robert Mitchum, a big-time future Hollywood star who landed his big break with this movie. And on that note, be sure to check out our 2 episodes analyzing one of Mitchum's other roles, where he plays General Norman Cota in the D-Day epic, The Longest Day.
Hardman, pull up! Pull up!
As a fun bit of trivia, this rainy street scene was actually filmed on Slauson Avenue and Sepulveda Boulevard in Culver City, California. I suppose they were looking for a good street with palm trees that could kind of replicate North Africa, and they found one not too terribly far away from Hollywood. And in fact, most of this movie was shot in the California desert, including the Iverson Ranch near Chatsworth, where a lot of westerns and other war movies of the time period were also shot.
It was chaos, indefinable, going up the brink of possible death.
One of the real strong suits of this movie is the incorporation of actual combat footage all throughout. Now, I can't say with absolute certainty that the combat scenes shown here were actually shot in North Africa, but it certainly is compelling stuff. And I'd like to add, if you've seen this footage elsewhere in newsreels or whatnot, let me know in the comments. I'd be interested in knowing the provenance of it. But the action depicted here took place on February 14th, 1943, when Pyle was embedded in the 2nd Army Corps. And in an hour of desperate combat, much like what's depicted here, German panzers and infantry overran panicked American soldiers at Kasserine Pass and pushed them back 50 miles. I mean, this is a huge black eye for the U.S. Army at the outset of its feud with the Germans. And for many of these GIs, the battle was their baptism of fire, and there were a lot of lessons that were hard learned that day. And Pyle later reflected that the defeat was perhaps a necessary evil so the Americans could grow accustomed to the sting of battle.
Their heavy tanks overran our position. Did the best I could, sir. Did the best I could.
Actor Freddy Steel was actually a middleweight champion of the world in the late 1930s before he started gaining bit acting roles in the early 1940s. And he often played simpleton characters, but man, his physicality lent a lot of heft to roles, especially like this one. And I gotta admit, I can't think of anyone better who has portrayed shell shock so convincingly. But this snapping under pressure was and remains a very real thing, not to be underestimated. And when Pyle was back in the States for a time after he had gone through North Africa and Italy, 2 teenage readers asked him about the traits of the sort of shell shock like we see shown here. And Pyle said such candid conversations made no one feel good, and it made no one feel complacent either.
Hey, what do you got in the package? Something to eat?
I don't know.
Well, open it. How you gonna find out if you don't open it?
It's an idea. It's from the old lady. Look what she's done. She had the kid's voice put on a record. Junior's voice.
The use of phonographs are mentioned in several of Pyle's writings, and they served as these portable means of escape, I think, to thoughts of home and bygone lives and ones that you're separated from. And cinematically, this gadget works really well for a subplot as Sergeant Warnicki makes it his quest to listen to this record on which his son's voice has been recorded. It's a fantastic artistic device used to underscore the long-distance separation from loved ones. unlike other features from the World War II years, these battle scenes are not hokey at all. The choreography is very free-flowing and natural, I think in no small part because these are actual GIs recreating their earlier battles. They know how to move under fire, they know how to carry their equipment and themselves. And I have no doubt Steven Spielberg revisited this movie when envisioning the final urban combat scenes in Saving Private Ryan. In my mind, this is one of the more incredible shots of the entire movie. These guys are no glorified extras. They can reload that artillery so quickly because they had done it under the real pressures of combat. And I just don't think regular actors could have pulled off a feat like is shown here.
Well, the yellow one is for national defense. The red and white is for very good conduct. The real pretty one over here with all the colors is for being in this theater of operations.
You know any good war stories, Sarge?
Yeah, as a matter of fact...
This shower scene speaks to the universal disparity between frontline troops and those often referred to as REMPs. And if you don't know what that means, I welcome you to look it up. In any regard, these troops could sometimes go weeks without showering, to the extent that their socks would essentially become cemented to their feet. This level of filth is just unparalleled in our modern mind, I think. And to have a shower operator showing off his ribbons, phew, there was nothing that would annoy a grunt more. I'm also reminded of a story from one of my other books, Fierce Valor, in which Captain Ronald Spears was noticing that cooks and clerks were wearing combat infantry badges and unit citation ribbons and all sorts of things like that, and he promptly told them to take those off, that they had not earned those ribbons and they had not earned those pins. And they had a job to do, it wasn't to fight, and those awards were going to be specifically designated for fighters, for warriors like he was. So there is that sort of friction between those fighting and those who are supporting those who are fighting.
A phonograph, a Victrola, a music box, see? What's the matter? Don't any of you guys understand plain English?
And here, too, this is the sort of subtle humor that Sergeant Foisey was writing to Lester Cowan about. And this sort of humor is very effectively sprinkled throughout the film because there is humor in military service. There has to be for you to emotionally be able to endure everything that you're going through. And this scene is indicative of countless interactions on the Allied advance where there is a language barrier. And I can relate to this to an extent. I've traveled through many European countries. I've done World War II living history in many of those lands, and I feel that I have almost recreated some of these moments in my own travels. To help American GIs with these sorts of predicaments, though, the United States War Department issued short guidebooks, short guidebook to Italy, short guidebook to France, so on and so forth. And in that, they were introduced to cultural norms and common sayings that might make this ice-breaking a little bit easier. But it's also worthwhile to note that many GIs of Sicilian and Italian descent did not always confront those same cultural and language barriers that their comrades did. In fact, some GIs had family members living in Sicily, in Italy. And there are at least one or two photos of American servicemen having gelato with some of their Italian cousins that they had either never met or hadn't seen since their childhoods. So there are some familial ties that can be found overseas.
To love and to cherish until death us do part.
Those whom God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. Hit the dirt!
This wedding scene is a very evocative one, and it perhaps taps into some of that sentimentality that Foisey said to avoid. But it does follow one of his other guidelines, and that is showing sort of the tough female hero. In this case, a nurse who has fallen in love with a GI from the platoon depicted in the movie. And your perhaps slightly useless little bit of trivia here is that the nurse shown is actually the director William Wellman's wife, Dottie.
You know that building up on top of the mountain?
The monastery?
Well, you can call it that if you want to. But I call it in military terms an observation post. If you don't want to get us all killed, you better give it the business.
Can't. Got an order about it. Religious shrine.
On December 29, 1943, Dwight Eisenhower had signed the Protection of Cultural Property Order. And in it, this is what he noted. If we have to choose between destroying a famous building and sacrificing our own men, then our men's lives count infinitely more, and the buildings must go. But the choice is not always so clear-cut as that. Nothing can stand against the argument of military necessity. That is an accepted principle. But the phrase military necessity is sometimes used when it would be more truthful to speak of military convenience or even personal convenience. I do not want it to cloak slackness or indifference. And so there's a degree of flexibility. It's kind of a gray area. How best do you protect these cultural landmarks? And to learn more about the intense debate over this very subject, we welcome you to check out our episode here on Real History, analyzing the Monuments Men.
Any of you dog faces know anything about a phonograph?
Hey! Gee, a guy could get killed around here.
I have explored the battlefields of Italy quite extensively, and I have no envy of the poor soldiers who had to fight through that terrain, because the best way to describe it is climb, fight, repeat. And when many Allied soldiers had landed in Italy, they thought they were going to be fighting under a gorgeous Tuscan sun, and they were going to be moving through picturesque countryside. But what they hadn't taken into account was the rain, the cold, and the mud that was going to afflict them around every corner. And we see that very authentically depicted in this movie. And this is what the real Ernie Pyle had to say about these conditions. Our troops were living in almost inconceivable misery. The fertile black valleys were knee-deep in mud. Thousands of men had not been dry for weeks. Other thousands lay at night in the high mountains with the temperature below freezing and the thin snow sifting over them. They dug into the stones and slept in little chasms and behind rocks and in half caves. They lived like men of prehistoric times. This very much speaks to the barbarity of the situation.
Our hero! Our hero! Our hero!
What's the gag?
Your mail, Mr. Pyle.
What's in it?
Oh, nothing much. You just won the Pulitzer Prize, that's all.
This is such a wonderful scene because these are actual combat correspondents that actor Burgess Meredith is interacting with. And going from left to right in the trifecta that we see here is firstly Cleet Roberts of the Blue Network, which later on becomes ABC. We have Robert Rubin from Reuters, who was a witness to D-Day and was an excellent and incredibly heroic war reporter. And I can't quite identify the third one on the far right. I haven't been able to perfectly match him up with any of the other correspondent technical advisors that are listed with this film.
The other outfits had turkey. The general had turkey. My men are gonna have turkey.
But we tried.
Trying ain't good enough. Either you get those turkeys or suppliers gonna have to get themselves a new lieutenant.
I'll
I'll scrounge around and see what I can find, sir.
And indeed, this is what true leaders do. They look after their people. They make sure that their enlisted men get hot food in their stomachs whenever possible. It speaks to the sort of selflessness that Ernie Pyle witnessed time and time again. But as to the dietary options here, anything beyond the bland and wholly unfulfilling C, D, or K rations was a welcome treat. And it was something that was especially needed around the holidays, whether it be Thanksgiving or Christmas. Making an effort to get turkey and filling and cranberry sauce up to the front lines, it was a monumental logistical effort, but it was something that was entirely necessary if you didn't want morale to break.
Names and addresses. And the hills to be taken. They'd be simply amazed at the number of hills still to be taken.
Ernie, why the devil don't you go home?
Often ask that myself.
If only we could create something good out of all this energy and all these men.
In my mind, this is perhaps Robert Mitchum's blue ribbon performance, and in fact, this was the only role in his long and celebrated career where he was actually nominated for an Academy Award, and he richly deserved it for this role, even though he didn't win it. For a while, it's interesting to note that actor Gary Cooper was in the running to play this role, but Wellman's good instincts kicked in and he decided to go with, like I said, a relatively unknown. Mitchum's character, though, is named Captain Walker, and it is based off of the real-life Captain Henry Waskow, who was a company commander in the 36th Infantry Division and who Ernie Pyle had the opportunity to spend a good bit of time with throughout his travels. And this is what he had to say about this beloved officer. In this war, I have known a lot of officers who were loved and respected by the soldiers under them, but never have I crossed the trail of any man as beloved as Captain Henry T. Waskow of Belton, Texas. Now, high words coming from Ernie Pyle.
General Eisenhower had made his decision. Bomb the monastery. He said, if we must choose between destroying a famous building and sacrificing our own men's lives, then our own men's lives count infinitely more.
This is truly incredible archival footage. This is the legit stuff. This is actual combat cameraman footage of the Monte Cassino Abbey being bombed. This is not something that could have been replicated so effectively by Hollywood. But a little bit of background on all of this. On February 15th, 1944, a large assortment of B-17s, B-25s, and B-26s pummeled Monte Cassino into a massive pile of rubble. You see it here for yourself. Now, many of the Germans who had been fortified within the abbey had relocated down to the slopes below, and very few of them were killed and wounded in this encounter. But sadly, there were 115 refugees in and around the abbey who were unfortunately killed by these American bombs who were falling on the site. And in the aftermath of all this, as World War II aficionados will know, the destroyed abbey becomes this splintered fortress that the Allies fruitlessly attack again and again and again in the weeks that will follow. And so it's a very bittersweet and costly victory in the long run. I had the chance to explore Monte Cassino with friends in 2023, and incredibly, the entire abbey has been rebuilt to what it looked like exactly before the war. I mean, it's just an incredible feat of endurance and reconstruction. But something interesting that I noticed, that in the memorial plaza that is at the base of the mountain below the abbey flies all of the flags of the Allied nations. And there's a Sherman tank that's there in the square too, if I recall correctly. But of all the flags that fly, the American flag is not amongst them. And I very much sensed that the local populace still had a degree of hostility against the United States for destroying its beloved and historic abbey.
Hello, Steve. Say hello to your daddy. Come on, Junior.
Hello, Daddy. Hello, Daddy. Hello, Daddy.
If it wasn't for them, I'd be home with Junior.
I love you.
I'd be home with little Junior.
Freddy Steel once again delivers here with his depiction of shell shock. The sergeant, the trusted, dedicated sergeant, the captain's #1 man, finally breaks. And he's here uttering, if it wasn't for them, I'd be home with Junior. And I think it just underscores the fact that there are limits to human endurance, even among good, trustworthy, non-commissioned officers like his character was. What we see here, once again, is some very effective incorporation of actual footage from the front lines. And in fact, this is footage from director John Huston's wartime documentary entitled The Battle of San Pedro, which is very effective in showing the human costs of war, even despite the fact that some excerpts of that movie were staged by Huston just a few days after the real fighting. But why it's valuable is that it really gives us a sense of terrain. It gives us a sense of the landscape and some of the natural hurdles that these GIs encountered in their travels. And it's also worthwhile to point out that John Huston, who had directed The Maltese Falcon before the war, goes on to direct other greats like Treasure of the Sierra Madre after the war. He, like so many other filmmakers of this time, had been to the front lines. They had filmed a lot of this stuff personally. And he was almost tapped to direct the true story of G.I. Joe. But he was in the service. He couldn't get out of the service. William Wellman ultimately took the helm. But 6 years later, John Huston would make a World War II movie of sorts. But it's actually set during the American Civil War, and that is The Red Badge of Courage, which we've also analyzed here on Real History. And why I call it a World War II movie set during the Civil War is that the entire cast, Audie Murphy among them, offer this reflection on what post-traumatic stress is. And it's a very compelling film in that regard, and I welcome you to check it out.
Don Darrow.
It's a cap.
This scene is such a gut punch, and it differs so much from other movies that we see being made during the war. In so many of the other films of this era, there's usually some sort of flag-waving finale about the fight must go on and, you know, buy war bonds at your theater and all this and that. And this movie lacks that sort of sappiness, if you will, altogether. And this is the moment that is somewhat of a recreation of the death of Captain Henry Waskow, which is one of Ernie Pyle's best known and most revered columns. And I think it's entirely worthwhile that I share just a portion of that column with you right now. And this is what Ernie Pyle had to write. Then a soldier came into the dark cow shed and said there were some more bodies outside. We went out into the road. 4 mules stood there in the moonlight, in the road where the trail came down off the mountain. The soldiers who led them stood there waiting. This one is Captain Waskow, one of them said quietly. 2 men unlashed his body from the mule and lifted it off and lay it in the shadow beside the low stone wall. Other men took the other bodies off. Finally, there were 5, lying end to end in a long row alongside the road. You don't cover up dead men in the combat zone. They just lie there in the shadows until somebody else comes after them. And Ernie Pyle goes on to say, time and time again, Captain Waskow's men came up to his body, and all of them had the same sentiment. They said, "I'm sorry, sir," "Sorry, old man," and so on and so forth. And one of them even crouches down and picks up the captain's hand and is there stroking his hand, almost as if to comfort his now deceased company commander. And this moment that Ernie Pyle captures with such poetic prose is depicted with such tenderness and care in this scene. And there's really nothing else like it in the cinema of this wartime era. So compelling.
That another great war can never again be possible. And for those beneath the wooden crosses, there is nothing we can do except perhaps to pause and murmur, "Thanks, pal. Thanks."
We have here a very jarring yet symbolic ending, the quote of which is taken directly from Ernie Pyle's "Here Is Your War." And ultimately, this movie was released in many U.S. theaters on June 18th, 1945, 2 months to the day that Ernie Pyle had been killed by the Japanese on Aishima off the Okinawa coast. He was only 44 years of age, and he never got to see this movie. In my mind, there is little else to say other than to reiterate Dwight D. Eisenhower's high opinion of this film. And as I said at the outset, I think that assessment comes down to that singular word of authenticity. You have a cast and a crew that had experienced the hard hand of war for themselves, and they wanted to create a true-to-life depiction of the G.I. Joe experience. And I think they wildly exceeded their own expectations and created one of the greatest cinematic tributes to the average infantryman. I will begin to conclude by noting that I have somewhat of a personal family connection to this film, and it requires a little bit of backstory. My grandfather was bound to be on leave in San Francisco from the Navy in August of 1945, and he telegrammed my grandmother-to-be back in Pennsylvania saying, "Come on out to San Francisco and we're going to get married." She conducted that journey all by herself, by train, a young girl who had never left her hometown before, and indeed, they were married in San Francisco on August 9th, 1945, the same day that the city of Nagasaki in Japan was bombed by atomic weaponry. And as I was going through some of their personal effects in more recent years, I found this promotional literature pertaining to Ernie Pyle's The Story of G.I. Joe. And it was among all these other items from their trip in San Francisco. And so I started to do a little bit of research, and lo and behold, I found out that The Story of G.I. Joe opened up in United Artists Theaters in San Francisco on August 9th, 1945, the very day that my grandparents were married. I therefore presume that they got hitched, they had their dinner at the Drake Hotel, and lo and behold, the United Artists Theater on Market Street was just about 3 blocks away from their hotel. And so it may seem like a very strange choice to go see a war movie, especially a sad war movie like this one, on your honeymoon. But I think it speaks to the widespread appeal and power of Ernie Pyle's story. And that's my family connection to this movie. I believe that this film fits within a trend of World War II cinema between 1945 and 1952, when you have all of these artistically repressed filmmakers who finally have the opportunity to get to the deeper, grittier meaning of the war. These were films that explored issues of post-traumatic stress, the strife of G.I. Joe, issues of post-war adjustment back to civilian life. And I believe that these are some of the finest World War II movies ever made in this 7-year time period. And before we head out, as I often do, I will offer a little bit of a reading recommendation. And I think that this book, The Soldier's Truth by David Krissinger, is a really fantastic portrait of Ernie Pyle, exploring his journeys and what he meant to the American public both then and now. You also can't go wrong in reading some of the books and columns by Ernie Pyle himself. And while we're on the topic of recommendations, I will also once again recommend to all you history and cinema buffs out there to pick up a copy of The Story of G.I. Joe, which has been restored by the Film Foundation and made available by Ignite Films. As I said at the outset, this is just a really fantastic Blu-ray package with all sorts of great extra features. And this is definitely one that you should have on your shelf. And I once again thank them for sending me some copies along so I can share it with all of you. In 2009, The Story of G.I. Joe was included in the Library of Congress's National Film Registry due to its historical, artistic, and cultural significance, and I think that most definitely is an accolade well earned. With all of that being said, we thank you for tuning in to this episode of Real History. As always, we invite you to hit those like and subscribe buttons, leave your thoughts below in the comments section, check out our t-shirt store, and also visit our website with all sorts of wonderful educational resources. Until we see you next time here on Real History, stay curious, my friends.